pleasure and privilege to welcome a close friend uh, and a mentor who I've known for the last 20 plus years. Uh, he's always been around to help give guidance. And he's a very busy man, but I appreciate his making the time today to speak to us. Pradeep Anand is an experienced business consultant who has helped CEOs, executives, and their teams in industrial and technology industries accelerate their revenues and margin growth, especially in disrupted environments. He has unique knowledge in taking advantage of disrupted markets. This knowledge has translated into simple frameworks for creating new business models that can be easily understood, supported, and implemented by rank and file employees. Since 1994, as president of Seeta Resources, he has helped more than 60 industrial and technology companies in North America and Europe in developing strategies and tactics to swiftly accelerate revenue and margin growth, especially during the Great Recession. His career in the US began in 1981, and during the oil and gas industry recession of the 80s, he helped commercialize some significant oil field technologies. Today, these technologies are multi-billion-dollar divisions of a major oil field services company. He is effective across multiple cultures, company, strata, and languages. He has worked across North America and Europe and conducted workshops, even with interpreters. Additionally, he taught marketing in the energy industry, a course on commercializing technologies in the oil field, as an adjunct faculty member at Rice University's Joan Graduate School of Business's MBA program. Pradeep is an engineer with an undergraduate degree from the Indian Institute of Technology, the Bombay IIT. He has an MBA from the University of Houston. He is a TEDx speaker, and his work of fiction, An Indian in Cowboy Country, Tales from an Immigrant's Life, was published in 2006. Writing has been his lifelong passion, and he is here today to talk about his writing journey and read an excerpt from the book, An Indian in Cowboy Country. My honor and privilege to welcome my close friend, my mentor, Pradeep Anand.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jagdip. Or Jay in this crowd. Thank you very much.
I insist on being Jagdip in this crowd.
Thank you. Yes, I have known Jagdip for the longest time, and we've been very good friends since then. And thank you for the privilege.
You said were, is there a change?
What's that?
You said we were very good friends. Does that change?
We have been very good friends since we met. And we are very good friends. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Thank you very much for having me. And that is a huge crowd. I mean, there are a lot of people out here, and I hope I can meet your expectations. Let me get very quickly into about my writing journey. I basically, when I was a child, my mother took me to an astrologer. That astrologer made two very curious predictions. He told my mother that I would be a disaster on any vehicle that had just two wheels. He also told her that I would be a terrible public speaker. Unfortunately, I turned these into self-fulfilling prophecies. I stayed away from bicycles and motorbikes. However, when my younger sisters began to ride bikes and began teasing me, I mustered enough courage to learn to ride a bike. Yes, I scraped my knees and ran into people, but I did learn to ride a bike. I also learned to ride my father's scooter after my 18th birthday, but I gave that up after someone threw himself in front of me, got hurt, and then tried to blackmail me into giving him some money, or else he would take me to the local police station. Instead, I took him to that very police station where he was recognized as a habitual traffic blackmailer, and the police inspector let me go home. That was the last day I rode a motorized two-wheeler. Also, coming to the second prediction, I refused to speak in public for fear that I'd make a fool of myself. And I never got over that fear of public speaking in India. In retrospect, that was a good thing. I was an introvert. However, I had that fertile, talkative mind that needed a release, and writing was a great alternative. I got my start as a letter writer from my grandfather. His hands trembled with age, and he could not write. But boy, could he dictate. His English was beautiful, and his paragraphs were long, complex sentences that we had learned to parse in our English grammar classes. Yes, I went to a school run by the Salesians of Don Bosco, a Catholic Italian education-focused order, and the medium of instruction was in English. Also, during that period of my childhood, it wasn't uncommon for 3 generations to live under the same roof. Our home was a flat or an apartment that had 3 rooms, including a kitchen, and the area was about 600 square feet. In addition, we had 4 balconies that added much needed personal space for each of us, and I claimed one to be my private area. Coming back to my grandfather, he gave me that jump start to writing letters as a hobby. The Indian government subsidized the Indian Postal Service, and this made letter writing an incredibly inexpensive hobby. I wrote letters to everyone I knew, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I even wrote to people I befriended during our vacations. And when I felt that my letter writing output was not adequate, I acquired pen pals, but only in India. I couldn't afford international postal rates. My father and grandfather were also voracious readers. Newspapers, magazines, and books were always around us, and we had a reading hierarchy for every category of publication. For newspapers, every morning our father read it first. He scanned the headlines and then he went to shave and shower. He gave the newspaper to my grandfather, who after a long leisurely read of every line in the paper gave it to me. I would read the front page for the top stories and the back page for updates on sports and the Tarzan comic strip that was serialized every day except Sundays. For books, the order depended on who brought the book into our home. Our parents had first dibs on Earl Stanley Gardner. Yes, I was a fan of Perry Mason, Agatha Christie, and Edgar Wallace murder mysteries. After that, these paperbacks collected mold and aged quickly in our wooden cupboards. After a few years, the glue on these paperbacks would dry out and the pages would turn yellowish brown. However, these seemingly vintage books were eminently readable for decades, and I read all of them. Magazines had a hierarchy driven by content. We did not subscribe to any magazine except Femina. The rest of the magazines that came through our home was courtesy the library at Mysore Association, and it was never the latest issues. However, we did not mind a dated Time magazine, Life, National Geographic, Filmfare, or Illustrated weekly magazines. Our mother and sisters had first dibs on Femina, a publication for women. The younger of my 2 sisters was given, she was a big movie fan, was given the privilege of reading Filmfare first. I read both after they had finished their turns. In hindsight, I would say that 2 types of reading drove me. One that provided me with information or knowledge, and the other that spurred my imagination. Books were at the top of my pile, but American and British comics were my favorites. I think I may have read at least 2 comics every day for about 15 years. That's just 10,950 comics plus 7, counting for leap years. I like numbers. One day in 1968, my letter writing, my knowledge, and my imagination collided, or you could say they came to a confluence. I decided to write a short story for Femina. Why Femina? So my mother and sisters and their friends would read it in a credible medium. An uncle had left behind a portable typewriter at our home, and in one sitting, I typed out a short story on ruled paper. I sent the original manuscript to Femina. A month later, the editors returned it to me with a kind reject letter. Luckily, they also returned the original manuscript. Undaunted, I sent the original manuscript to Femina's competitor. It was called Eve's Weekly. And then I waited. and then I forgot all about it. A year later, when I was a student at IIT Bombay, I recalled a submission to Eve's Weekly and wrote a letter to the editor wondering what had happened to my submission. I received a quick reply saying that since it was submitted a while ago, and quotes, within quotes, I remember the words, in all probability, the story may have been published. I wrote back to them, suggesting that since the story had been published, when would I receive payment for it? A week after I had mailed that letter, my story was published and I received a check for 55 rupees or $50 in today's dollars, US dollars. It was fun being an introvert. People, especially adults, would say I'm shy and leave me alone with my thoughts. Live, meaningless, polite conversations did not clutter my life. I was left to my own devices. I did take part in individual and team sports and excelled at many, but then sport was a very different kind of engagement that did not need conversation, except a few grunts here and there. For years, I would observe people and conjure stories about them mentally. I was especially intrigued by the disenfranchised people of India. One day in 1973 or so, when I was traveling by a slow-moving bus, I saw the street urchin outside Tata Textile Mills in Parel, Bombay. Our father worked at that location, and I would often peer out of the bus window to see if I could get a glance of him. Instead, I saw this child amid what are called dawawalas. These are people who transport and distribute food containers from people's homes to their workplaces, and then after lunch, take back the empty containers, all within 5 hours or so. It is a uniquely Bombay phenomenon. Within hours of seeing this child, I'd written Sham Sakaram Tabarto. That's the name of the character. My second short story. Unlike the first one, I did not send it to any publication. I kept the handwritten manuscript in a manila folder and forgot all about it. After writing Sham Sakaram Tabarto, I wrote poetry and articles that I stored in this manila folder. I was still a prolific letter writer. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also wrote rhyming lines and humorous ballads about my friends and their misadventures. I wrote thousands of lines, but they were very, very silly. I like limericks. So I'll give you an example of my silly lines. His kiss was as hot as the weather in the south, but then she saw that he had a cigarette in his mouth. I wrote to entertain my friends. I was still very introverted when it came to speaking to women. In early 1974, I wrote a rare letter to the editor of Filmfare magazine. It won the magazine's best letter prize, another 50 rupees, again $50 in today's terms. Many friends and students at IIT Bombay read Filmfare and recognized my name. Some paid me compliments and wondered aloud if I was going to use my prize money to throw a party. Students are the same everywhere. However, one of them, Kirat Patel, who was the editor of the campus magazine, annual magazine, wondered aloud if I would write for the magazine. Kirat was a good friend, but the introvert in me had prevented me from sharing my writings with him until then. I told him that I had some manuscripts and he was welcome to read them. He came to my room in an instant and took the manila folder away with him. He came back many hours later to tell me that he had selected my short story, Sham Sakaram Tabarto, a few of my poems, and an indescribable flow of consciousness piece for publication. A few months later, my contribution about this little kid that I saw outside the textile mill won the Maharashtra state, where Bombay is located. It's like Houston in Texas. I got the Maharashtra State Award for the best short story of the year. The irony was that an engineering student won this literary award, and that was in 1975. After I graduated from IIT Bombay, I joined the workforce in India, but my spare time was focused on creative activities. All India Radio featured me on their Writers of Tomorrow program. I was selected to co-host a television program by India's only TV channel, Doordarshan's Bombay office. The program Merry-Go-Round was in English and focused on young world. My host, Gopi Menon, a classmate and a buddy from IIT Bombay, and I had a ball. I wrote the humorous scripts and he delivered the lines. I was the straight introverted guy and I did not have to act. I was successful at work and play, and I was even a minor celebrity. Common people of Bombay recognized me because of my presence on TV, and one even bought me a cup of tea, and another bought my bus ticket on one of my many trips in the city. And in 1978, I dropped all that and came to Houston for graduate studies at the University of Houston. Very soon, I discovered that I had lost all my intuitive understanding of people and their nuances. I was in an alien world and I had to discover humanity all over again. Despite being an engineer, I'm not a thinking and sensing person. 15 years later, I discovered the Myers-Briggs test that said that instead, I was an intuitive and perceptive person. Unknown to me, then I was at square one, ground zero on both these dimensions. I knew nothing about this new environment, and my learning was a slow one. I was now a graduate student, and ironically, with a teaching fellowship at the university. While teaching undergrads at U of H's business school, I quickly learned to drop my inhibitions and shed parts of my introverted nature. Unlike being in Bombay, where I had a great job at a Dutch multinational company, the aura of having graduated from one of the best engineering schools in India, and now it's also the world, and being a TV host, I now had no safety net. My personal equity was zero. If I failed, there was nothing that would help me bounce back in this country. So I gave up all activities that did not contribute to my professional success. I gave up writing fiction, but I did continue writing letters to my parents who were in India. These were voluminous letters crammed into an aerogram. International correspondence was still very expensive. Intermittently, I would write a humorous article or two for the India Students Association's newsletter, a cyclo-style publication with limited distribution. Later, I joined the oil and gas industry, and my focus on creative writing diminished even further until it reemerged in 2003. After 25 years of immersion in this society. The first story I wrote was The Interview. The protagonist was someone who had the same anxieties that most immigrants from India and I had then in the recessionary times of the oil and gas industry, not unlike today. Our jobs, our families, and our future in our newly adopted country. And then I drove back and forth from 1966 to 1991. After The Interview, I wrote 7 short stories, but 2 were split into 2. They were not that short. So now there are 10 short stories about anxieties of Indian engineers and immigrants, 5 set in Bombay or Mumbai, and 5 set in Houston. Interestingly enough, the first story, Rites of Passage, set in Mumbai, is also an immigrant tale. So when I wrote this series of stories, I first went to FedEx Kinko's and made a handsome compilation for my wife, Sujata, who knew nothing of my endeavor. She's an avid reader and likes to read fiction. She loved the stories, some more than others. She loved the compilation and told a friend who then requested me for a copy. Every reader likes to be read. I was back at Kinko's making another handsome copy. And then I had another satisfied reader who then told her brother who requested a copy. I made a copy for my sister and my brother who lived in the neighborhood before I gave this friend's brother a copy. And each copy cost me $25. That's in 2006. Yes, it was 2003. Yes, every writer likes to be read, but this was getting expensive. That's when I decided to take the commercial route and pursue publishers and agents. 3 years later, in November 2006, the book was released. We had a book release party at the old Stafford Civic Center that you all know. That night, I signed I signed over 400 copies. An Indian and Cowboy Country was published in India and released in December 2010. It was on the bestseller lists at Crossword and other major booksellers in India. The book was available on Amazon in 2007. The book suddenly and surprisingly popped up on Amazon's top 100 in the men's adventure list. Briefly, very, very briefly, my book was ranked on that list one notch above Ian Fleming's You Only Live Twice. I then recalled Andy Warhol's words, in the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. Those were my 15 minutes of fleeting fame as a writer. And here I am, 13 years later, addressing the esteemed members of this Rotary Club and their friends. Thank you for having me. I will now read an excerpt from Rites of Passage from the first chapter of An Indian in Cowboy Country. Does it sound okay? Did it come through? Okay. Okay, the first, it's a very short excerpt, so I'm going to do this as fast as possible. So these are 6 kids or 7 kids who have gone to see a movie. This movie is, I'm sure many of you remember this movie. It's a very classic. We're all fans of Westerns, like movie fans, and among them Westerns. And the movie these guys decided to pick, which was a rite of passage in those days, when you were 16, you went and saw a movie that was meant for 18-year-olds, which are what are called in India adults only, or rated R over here. There's no concession for being accompanied by adults. So you have to prove you're 18 and you don't have IDs. You have to look the part. So you dress up to look much older than you are, and you go to see this movie. These kids decided that from the school, decided they were going to see their first adults-only movie, which was a Western. And after they had seen the movie, the 6 walked past the colonial Bombay Gymkhana, cutting across Cross Maidan. Maneuvering between cricket and soccer games, they reached Churchgate Station, where they bought tickets and collectively boarded a fast train. Sandesh's home, they were all headed for Sandesh's home. Sandesh's home was in the center of Dadar Bibi, the common name of this western half of Dadar. It's a neighborhood like Sugarland. Jimmy and Satish lived on the eastern side of Tilak Bridge in Dadar TT, which had 2 large neighborhoods, Parsi colony and Hindu colony. Gujarati-speaking Zoroastrians like Jimmy, who were originally from Persia and had come to India to escape religious persecution, dominated Parsi colony. Hindu colony's residents were mostly Marathi-speaking Hindus, with a smattering of people like Satish, who's the protagonist, who spoke better Marathi, the local language, than his mother tongue. Cedric was a Roman Catholic and lived in the Portuguese church area. By the way, the city of Bombay was actually, the name Bombay has origins in Portuguese. It was originally called Bombahia, and then Bombahia, when the British took over, it turned into Bombay, and today it's Mumbai. Cedric was a Roman Catholic and lived in the Portuguese church area, a Christian neighborhood a few minutes away from Sandesh's home. Zia's home was just north of Dadar Bibi in Mahim, which had a large concentration of Muslims and Catholics. Vijay lived in Matunga, north of Dadar TT, an enclave where a majority of South Indian immigrants to the city lived. Most spoke very little Marathi there. As their train approached Dadar Bibi, they sensed that something was wrong. The platform was unusually crowded, and then, when they tried to disembark, the incoming throng was uncommonly forceful and rough in its entry. The vigor of the crowd pushed Zia, the skinniest of them, back into the compartment, while the rest pushed through and got off the train, shaken and disheveled. Their shirts were out of their pants, their creased trousers were ruffled, and their hair tousled and windswept. They did little to groom themselves. Their attention was drawn to the smoke and soot that filled the air. Jimmy dismissed these at first, attributing them to a steam engine that may have passed by. But Sandesh cautioned them. The smoke smelled of burned rubber. Guardedly but briskly, they left the station, noticing that there were no TCs and ticket checkers around. Jimmy nervously joked that they had wasted their scarce money on train tickets. Usually, the side street outside the station was a bustling market with loud hawkers and peddlers selling a variety of wares: clothes, handkerchiefs, slippers, sandals, flowers, vegetables, spices, country medicines, and fast food. These hawkers yelled to attract attention of disembarking passengers. Street vendors occupied not only the spacious sidewalks but also parts of the road. There was little room for cars to pass without honking. As they stepped out of the station, they did not hear the familiar deafening cacophony. They heard nothing. There was neither a hawker nor a car in sight. The streets were empty, but in the distance, a mass of panic-stricken people was rushing toward the station and them. They avoided the clamoring crowd by sticking to edges of the street, and when the crowd had passed them by, they began walking vigorously in the direction of Sandesh's home, unconsciously breaking into a run, brushing past oncoming strangers. Sandesh's home was just 500 yards away. 50 yards from the station, they would make a left turn and run about 300 yards on the adjoining street, and they would turn right and rush another 150 yards to reach the safety of his home. As they dashed through and made the first run, they saw a mob at the other end of the street throwing stones and flaming bundles of cloth at stores. Between the mob and them, 3 cars were burning. In the distance, a familiar red double-decker BST bus stood naked and charred to its metallic frame. They realized that they were cut off from Sandesh's home, and there were no other safe havens around them. They had no choice except to go back to the station and take the first train out of Dadar. Just as they reached the station, hordes poured out and started running helter-skelter. A train pulled in with a burning compartment, and all train services were terminated. Railway police had taken over and were indiscriminately beating people and forcing them out of the station. Satish and friends were trapped. They had missed the last train out of Dadar. If I have another 2 minutes, I'll add another part to this. Venu, do I have time? Okay, thanks. Just then, Cedric recalled that a family friend owned a car repair shop nearby. They would seek refuge there. There were no dissenters or second-guessers among them. Instantly, they ran breathlessly to the garage that stood at the end of a small lane. They stopped at the tall iron gate, gazing at the tiny spears and barbed wire that stood guard at the top. Undeterred, Cedric climbed up the gate. With a few minor bruises, he reached its crest. As soon as his head breached the crown of the gate, they could hear people yelling from within the garage, asking him to go away. Cedric reached into his shirt and showed them the large silver crucifix he wore around his neck. He yelled in Konkani, his mother tongue, that he needed help. The gate opened quickly and they were led onto this large property strewn with dilapidated and decrepit cars. Oscar, the 50-year-old owner of the place, recognized Cedric. He admonished him and his friends for being out on such a dangerous evening. He told them there had been a political rally at the nearby Shivaji Park. The crowd had been brought to a frenzy by hate speeches that labeled South Indians as the cause of unemployment amongst Maharashtrians, people native to Bombay. After the meeting ended, crowds went around looting and burning shops, especially the South Indian-owned restaurants that dotted the city. They also beat up any recognizable South Indian along the way. Oscar, upon learning that Vijay and Satish were Southerners, quickly escorted them to a tin-roofed, single-story, ramshackle building at the remote end of his lot. It was Oscar's office, and in the light of the solitary low-wattage bulb that illuminated the room, They could see a few filing cabinets and a desk with a manual typewriter. The stench of stale motor oil and gasoline was intense. Oscar found 2 small stools for them to sit on, and taking them behind the cabinets, asked the boys to sit still and be silent. As he left the building, he reached out to a nearby lug wrench and smashed the lone bulb, instantly plunging the office into darkness. As their eyes adjusted to the night, they could see some light pouring in from the windows and around the edges of the shut door. They sat for hours in the shadows, quietly listening. They heard waves of mobs passing around through the area, some hurling stones at the solid steel gate and into the compound, hitting cars. But nobody at Oscar's garage made a sound. There was deathly stillness between instances of mob fury, and they could hear sounds of gunfire, rare in the Bombay air. They sounded different from the gunshots in the movie that they had just seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bravo. Excellent. I was totally engrossed.
That was outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, all of you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here.